The next presentation is going to involve regulating the use of the crop, and it's going to be moderated by Sue Finley, who's the Senior Vice President and co-publisher of the Thoroughbred Daily News, a publication many of us read on a daily basis. So Sue, I'm going to let you introduce the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Donna, and welcome to the Welfare and Safety Summit's panel on the much talked about topic of the whipping of racehorses. As this is the only non-scientific panel of the day, and rather a discussion that's open to interpretation, opinion, sometimes some hysteria, we're going to try to keep it more of a discussion. So to that end, I welcome audience participation by tweeting at Jockey Club or using the hashtag Horse Summit. The first thing you'll notice about our panel today is that I'm the only person on the stage who is actually not a retired jockey. I'm joined by Hall of Fame rider Chris McCarron, who retired in 2002 with 7,141 wins and who currently instructs aspiring jockeys at the North American Racing Academy here in Kentucky, which he founded to help young riders learn to race ride properly. Gunnar Lindberg is the senior racing official of the Alcohol and Gaming Commission of Ontario and a steward licensed at all thoroughbred racetracks in Ontario. He rode races from 1973 to 1991. And Ramon Dominguez, of course, was our country's winningest jockey on numerous occasions, winning the Eclipse Award in 2010 and 2011. He won over 4,000 races and was the recipient of the 2012 George Wolfe Memorial Award. So welcome to all of you. I'm going to start the discussion with a question raised by the noted horse behaviorist Monty Roberts. Monty wrote, "We in racing need to be proactive. We need to realize that many potential fans abhor the use of the whip and are turned off by our sport. What if we had whipless racing? Someone would be first, someone would be last, and someone would be in the middle, exactly as it is with whips. Would you not prefer the horse to run out of a natural desire rather than running from pain? And wouldn't we be more acceptable to our audience?" So, gentlemen, I'm going to ask each of you in turn that question. Rather than sort of discussing this by increments, I thought we'd jump right into the, would we be better off with whipless racing?
I guess I'll go first. I'm the elder statesman, I think. I don't think we'd be better off to go with whipless racing, but I'm looking for some reform with regard to how the crop is used and how often it's used and so forth. But the whip is a very useful tool. It certainly, we use it to encourage the horse to run. But I'd like to digress just for a second, and for the benefit of full disclosure, I need to share with you that I was known as a rider that used the stick a lot. Early in my career, I thought my job was to force the horses to run, to make them run. And as I got older and smarter, I think, I realized that the horses are out there, they're giving you their all for the most part. There are some horses that are a little bit lazy or conservative that need the stick for encouragement. But my style and my attitude towards the use of the crop evolved, and I used it a lot more judiciously late in my career than I did early in my career. So I like to think that that evolution of my form and my style, my attitude, was for the benefit of not just the horse, but for public perception as well.
Ramon?
Yes, and just like Chris, my journey as a jockey was very similar, where in the beginning I went from overusing the stick because on lack of knowledge that I just thought that that's the way it needed to be. The more you use a stick, the better your chances. And as I continued to learn, I realized it wasn't as necessary. Going back to the question that Sue asked, yes, if you do away with the riding crop, still there will be a winner and a loser. At the same time, I do agree with Chris, just from the safety standpoint, I would like to have one. But I would like to, before we talk about the usage of the riding crop, which is really the title for this segment, I would like to go back in history briefly about the riding crop itself, because it is important to know that up until 2008, the riding crop that was being used, really there was a need for a change. And sure enough, the padded riding crop, which is what is being used right now, came along. And that has been, no questions about it, a very positive change that very quickly, in no time, was adopted by most racing jurisdictions, as well as created awareness within the horsemen, including the jockeys, as well as the racing officials. And without a question, the racing industry has been moving into the right direction when it comes to the riding crop. However, why is it that there is so much negative attention on this topic? If you go back to the last 8 years and you ask anyone about it, the answer almost always has been perception. And often followed by perception is reality. The belief of our fans create their perception, and these perceptions, accurate or inaccurate, will have an effect on their outlook of their sport. But now, talking more about perception, what if Martin Luther King or Nelson Mandela or Steve Jobs has said, perception is reality? The greatest leaders in the world know that reality is reality, and we need to do everything possible to help people understand the facts. Now, we could look at this and analyze this usage of the riding crop from so many different perspectives, on different elements, and even if we, in the attempt to really come up with a uniform reform, but even if we have something in place, a set of rules that pleases most people, one of the biggest challenges is that we are not talking about motorcycles. We're talking about horses. Horses that have different demeanors, horses that have different responses. So therefore, one size does not fit all. Now, I will tell you that we need, it is a must. We need to educate our fans about, one, how the riding crop is actually beneficial when it comes to the safety of the racing industry, but also how it is humane. Until then, we will be pretty much pushing water uphill. Now, having said all that, again, I do believe, in my opinion, the riding crop is a very overrated piece of equipment. But just for safety reasons alone, if I'm on the back of a racehorse, I want to make sure that I have one in my hand.
Gunnar?
Again, along with my colleagues, Chris and Ramon, I do feel there's a need for a whip. It does need to be limited, however. We're an entertainment industry, and we are an option for the public. I bring people up to the stand. That's my enjoyment about one of the things I can do in my job is I can bring people up to the stand, or I can take them to the backstretch, and I can tell them about racing. And I can show them in the stand what it is we do, and I can show them the race, and after the race, we look at the incidents down the lane, and the first thing that I get from somebody is, look at that jockey hitting that horse. And then I have to go and I have to explain that we have a program in Ontario, and actually a very successful program, one which started back in 2009. And it was not without its challenges. There certainly was a learning curve. But I have to explain to these people that we do have a soft touch whip. Somebody can only hit a horse 3 strikes in a row, and then they have to give the horse a chance to respond. They can't raise their hand above their ear. Actually, the rule reads the shoulder, but we, for common sense sake, it's very hard to distinguish when riders drop their head or you're looking at a certain view on the TV, what is above the shoulder and what's above the ear. So we will give them to just about their ear. If they're coming over the helmet, that's definitely a warning. The challenges that we had in bringing in our program started in 2009. We gave them these set of rules, and actually it was quite honestly how this was initiated was the riders at first were not happy with the way we were grabbing them and saying, you know, you've hit this horse too many times down the lane. And they're going, well, you've got a number. And we said, well, no, we don't have a number. But in actuality, I guess we did in the back of our minds. We would say, we used a barometer of 15, and we would then count those strikes down lane, and we would bring that rider in. So the riders kind of said, we need something in black and white. And we got all the industry officials together. We got the HPPA, we got the horsemen's group, the jocks groups, the association, the commission, and we sat down and we banged out these rules. And this is what we came up with. 3 strikes, have to give them a chance to respond. Nothing over the ear. And the learning curve was that we brought this in slowly. We said, we're going to give you guys time to adhere to this. We know that you've been riding for years, and this is going to be a difficult change for you. So we gave them a month's worth of grace. And then we had movie reviews where we actually showed them incidents of compliance and incidents of violations. And we would give them a warning after that, and then we would give them a movie review. And quite honestly, that first year we had 50-some violations and fines and suspensions. So that was tough. The following year, we had 30 violations and suspensions. And since then, we're down to 12 and 10 violations per year. So while the use of the whip, I think, is instrumental on a horse, one, to shake them up, one, for safety reasons, it needs not to be abused. So you have to limit the number of strikes. We're in the entertainment industry. And we're an option for people out there in the public. And if that's their perception that horses are being abused, then we're going to lose that segment of the population. Now, I agree with Ramon that education is a very good tool. But even when I talk to the people that come up to the stand and they look at this and they tell me, oh, look at that rider strike that horse, and I explain to them these rules that we go through and how we're very strict. We'll sit there the next race, and I have to tell them about that whip and how it's a soft touch, and you can hit yourself with it and it won't hurt. But they sit and they watch the next race, and now they're looking for those strikes. And they're saying, oh, look at there, is that a violation? And we'll have to explain, no, you know what, he caught him 3 times. Well, it looks like he caught him 4. No, actually, that was a wave. But that's the perception that people are looking at. And if we're trying to attract new people in an era where our industry is in a decline, then I think it needs to be addressed. Does it need to be taken completely away? No. But who do we educate? Do we educate the masses? Or do we educate our own industry to the big picture and what's happening?
So,
I think spare the rod and spoil the customer, so to speak.
Yeah, if I can take it back to perception a minute. So I chose this photo to illustrate our talk today. And as you can all see, it's a photo in Europe. I think everybody will agree that this conversation has been more advanced in Europe than it has here, where they started talking about the number of strikes, where to raise the whip, softer whips, et cetera. And you know, this is a photo I chose not to be sensational in any way, just a normal photo that we would use every day in the Thoroughbred Daily News. And so I'd ask you to look at it and say, would the general public looking at this say, well, he doesn't have his hand over his ear, or, you know, he's only hit him 3 times, or is the whip softer? Or is this a turnoff to the general public? When you go back to perception and you look at this picture, what does it say to each of you, I guess? It's the first question.
Well, it's something that stands out. But Ramon is right in the respect that even though we have this set of rules in Ontario that seem to have worked, and we have limited the amount of strikes, people still don't like it. And so where do you go from there? Like, how can you make it any better? We're pretty strict in Canada.
And yet this is still the image of racing that
That would be
we
a
see.
violation.
Only from the guy in the green, maybe. Ramon?
Yes, no. It's funny because I'm listening to Gunnar, and he's describing how when they implemented the new rules that they have, they went from having a lot of penalties to way less, and then the third year it was a lot less. So there was a big decrease, which is great. Now, would you say that that's successful, that you guys are being successful? And yes, perhaps you have achieved the goal of people following these rules that have been implemented. On the other side, when you think in terms of the fans, you're telling me they still will be perceiving this as if, well, you know, they're still hitting the horses. So I just feel like we could never really be in a place where we need to be as the industry, as far as really people getting a clear picture of what this is all about, until people get educated within the industry and outside the industry. What is the best vehicle to do that? I don't have the answer. However, I do know that as long as we continue trying to please the perception, we will never move forward. I mean, it doesn't matter if you minimize it to striking the horse 3 times altogether throughout the race, because the emphasis, the focus, the attention from the fan is going to be on the whip. If you make clear, as I mentioned before, about how this has evolved in a positive way, they will be focusing on what horse is going to win. The last thing that they will be really looking at is how high the whip came up or how many times the jockey hit the horse the last 16 of a mile. I'm by no means saying that these rules are not important. Absolutely. We need to continue to evolve in many different aspects of the industry. But it is important to educate people as well.
Have anything you'd like to add?
I'm going to go back to one of my first comments about me being a stick rider. When I was riding against Lafitte and Shu and Eddie Delahousie and Gary Stevens and so forth, and Pat Day would come out to California occasionally, I became very envious of those fellows, because Trevor would always very emphatically announce under a beautiful, polished hand ride by Lafitte Pinkai. And I tried to emulate them as much as I could, but it was difficult. It was difficult because I'm sure my colleagues here would agree, it's much more strenuous to hand ride a horse than it is to use the stick. A lot of times jocks will go to using the stick to give their arms a breather. It's much more difficult to try to copy Lafitte or Shu or Pat when they're doing that beautiful polished hand ride. In the beginning, when I would try that, I'd get beat on nose. And I'd say, stupid McCarron, just ride the horse the way you used to ride him. And then one day, the third time in a particular period of time, I'm not sure exactly how many months it was, probably, it might have been even a year, but I was fined $250 for cutting a horse. A while later, I was fined $500, and then a short while later, I was fined $1,500. I'm very embarrassed to share that with you. But when I saw the Polaroid photographs of the horse that I rode, it made me sick. I mean, I cut his left side, and I swear to God, I thought I was going to throw up. I won 7 races on that horse. And when the owner found out I got fined $1,500, he wanted to give me that $1,500 and reimburse me for that penalty, for that fine. Education, it's going to be difficult to educate the trainers. It's going to be difficult to educate the owners, and it's going to be even more difficult to educate the general public. Because John Q. Public, who's a player, a gambler, wants to see that. They want to see that you're making every possible effort to get the best placing you can. So we got a lot of work to do as far as changing first of all, the reality, and then causing a whole new perception in the eyes of our patrons. I eventually was able to change my form, change my style, and it has to do with what part of the stride should you be striking the horse? When the horse is collected, when the horse's head is up in the air and its hindquarters are up in front of the flank protecting it, that's the time that you should apply the crop. Not when the horse is fully extended, because that whole soft tissue area is fully exposed. There's a great video on YouTube. It's a study that this lady in Australia did about use of the crop. And it's very, very scientific. And they also revealed to us that, well, the perception is, well, a horse's hide is a lot thicker than ours. We're not hurting them. Well, it's quite the contrary. Their hide might be thicker, but their nerve endings go all the way to the surface of the skin. Consequently, we are hurting them. We are creating discomfort. We are creating pain, causing pain. So we've got to, I'm happy to be here today because we got to move this forward. I don't know any other way to get this started other than to try to educate the owners and the trainers. I rode a lot of horses for a lot of trainers who would make a comment to me like, I don't want this son of a gun sleeping on his left side tonight. And I would go out there and ride accordingly. So it's very important. One of the things that I taught my students at NARA when I was teaching was the proper use of the crop. And if you start out using it the right way and you build that muscle memory, you're going to be able to use it appropriately. But I encourage you to YouTube Australian whip study, and I think you'll find it fascinating. I went so far as to say that, this study goes so far as to say that over-whipping a horse could actually slow them down. They sulk. I will tell you this, though, on the contrary. If I didn't have a stick on Ali Sheba, he wasn't going forward. He's like a bicycle. If you're not pedaling him, he's not going forward. There was one other comment. Oh, shoot.
We'll come back to you.
Yeah.
One quick question then before, I think we have a question from the audience, but let me ask you one quick thing. So do you think, you've said how many times you felt uncomfortable at your own use of the whip and your own behavior, and if people look at a picture like this and can't discern whether or not horses are being hurt, I'm just going to ask you each in 10 to 15 seconds to let me know, are they right to be uncomfortable? Do you understand that discomfort? And is there any way to educate past that? If people come in, take a look and say, I'm sorry, that just makes me uncomfortable.
I think they have every right to be uncomfortable. I'm uncomfortable looking at it, even though that's the way I used to ride. I got to the point where I said that was wrong.
Ramon?
Yes, I want to go back and point out that it's important because I know this is also being seen online, that when the story that Chris told about where the horse got caught, and that's something that has been greatly, greatly minimized since the induction of the current padded whip, that you hardly ever see that now. So again, I just want to bring to awareness that the positive changes that have been made where it's way, way softer for the horse. Now, I will piggyback on what Chris says. I'm sorry, it's just 15 seconds. So I do think that, of course, when people see this, it may come across as something that is being forceful or something that is being negative. And my 15 seconds is up. I will go over that.
I think the big thing here, I mean, we're trying to come down to all the same thing. What's going to make people happy? And I think limiting the number of strikes is a good start. And, horses are only going to run so fast. Even up, where we are in Canada, we've limited the number of strikes. Horses aren't running any slower. Our track records are still being beaten. They're not being abused. It does look like a better product. And I think the public is more attuned to it. It's you have to limit it somewhere. You have to start somewhere. And you know what, too? I know we talk about, again, the learning curve for the riders, and I get it. These guys have been riding a while, and they're professionals, but that's just the point. They are professionals, and they're going to be able to adhere to this rule if it's enforced. So we've got to look at the big picture. We're looking to increase our fan base, and again, if people think that the horses are being abused, then we're not going to increase that fan base. It's the way of the world now. I mean, you're noticing, when we talked about it earlier, the circuses are now getting rid of the elephants. You know, people don't want to see animals abused, and if that's their perception, we have to change that.
I think we have a question from the audience.
I've actually got a couple, and I'm just going to ask them and then let you determine how you would like to go.
Okay.
The first is, how do you judge that response? How do you know the horse is responding to the crop? And how do you judge it from the jockey perspective and then also from the steward perspective? And a couple other questions. It's been mentioned about crop being used or needing a crop for safety purposes, and to have some of them explain that aspect as well.
I would like to respond the first one about how do you know when a horse is responding, and that has to do with what I was going to say before about that every horse is different, and as Chris was saying about Ali Shiva. First, I do agree with him when it comes to the whip or the riding crop is something that can actually, in many cases, have a negative effect. Now, on the other hand, it's really pleasing not only the perception of the public, but also the perception even from our own horsemen, the trainers and the owners. So that is going to require some effort. Again, in order to move forward and to be on firm ground, we're going to have to do it correctly by educating them. So through my journey riding, the last 10 years I rode, I won most races without using the riding crop at all. Now, you may say, well, if it worked for you, how come the other jockeys can do it? Because it's not as simple as say, don't use the riding crop. There are cases where you absolutely need it. And without going too deep into the psychology behind this, is something that I was able to learn, which anybody can learn, about the art of listening to the horse, being present with the horse, and therefore allowing them to relax, and they will finish up as hard as they can without really having to encourage them. So that's something that absolutely can be implemented to train the new riders, as well as to tell the trainers, if you don't see the guy using the riding crop, there is a reason behind, and it's actually for the best. Now, having said that, there are cases that come to mind. One of them is I went to ride a very good horse of the year called Gio Ponti in Dubai, in a race called the Dubai World Cup. It's the richest race in the world. It's a $10 million race. And long stretch, the horse is gaining momentum. And I'm going to answer now the question. Every time I reach back and encourage the horse with the stick, he will jump. He will really respond very well. And he's gaining momentum very slowly. And I hit him a couple times, and he will respond. I'm going to have to reach it back and hit him again. As simple as that. So sure enough, he got up for fourth position by only like a head or a neck. And financially, there was a difference of $500,000 for my owners. And even if you put the money aside, it was the right thing to do for the horse achieving his top performance, because he was really responding. He wasn't tired. He was finishing up well. As well as, in this case, there was no betting, at least no overseas, because it's not allowed. But if that would have happened here, people are also betting, and our role is to really provide them with the best that we can. Now, after the race, the stewards called me, and they were going to fine me, which it would have been a very high fine, because I used the riding crop more than the rule. So I requested if it could be taken in consideration that here in the United States, although it is a different racing jurisdiction, I was known to really not to use the riding crop. They let me step out, and they said that they took that in consideration, and they basically gave me a warning. So again, everything is not apples to apples. Every horse is different, and all of that needs to really be considered.
Gunnar, do you want to answer the question from a steward's point of view?
Well, it's very hard for a steward to tell whether that horse is responding or not. I mean, if he's making ground, it could be him or it could be the whip. We don't really have a limit on the amount of times you can hit a horse. It's more of a succession thing. We don't want to see you hit a horse more than 3 times quickly. And that's a big one. So when somebody gets into a horse 4, 5, 6 times in rapid succession, then that, I mean, a horse doesn't have time to respond, quite honestly. And even 3 in a row, I mean, can he respond from every time you strike him? And in a case like Ramon, he almost explained it as though he hit him, rode him, he hit him, he rode him. You know, it's the same thing you see it with young apprentices. When they first start out their first 5 rides, they can't carry a stick. And they look good out there. And then you give them a stick, and all of a sudden they lose what they were doing, and everything's about that stick. And the next thing you know, they're throwing the horse's head away, and the horse is floundering, and they're pounding away. And horses want to be held together. They quite honestly, and even Chris said, you know, it's harder to maybe hand ride a horse, but that's what horses want. They want to be held together and feel like you're with them, and that bit in their mouth. And then you can you know try him a couple times, and the jock's going to know whether he responds. And then if he didn't respond, try him left-handed. Maybe shake him up a little bit. If he doesn't respond, well, you know what? Put the stick away.
Well, speaking of how riders look without it, Chris, did you want to add something?
Well, I agree with everything that these guys have said, and but I'd like to share a comment with you that might surprise a few people. But if you watch American Pharaohs races, Victor never hit him in the Arkansas Derby. He hit him 32 times from the 5/16 pole to the wire in the Kentucky Derby. He hit him a couple times in the Preakness and a couple times in the Belmont. He beat him up in the Travers. I firmly believe that he only won by a length because he was hit and struck so many times. I think that horse got to the point where he was just going to, you know, say, the heck with you, I'm not trying anymore. But he's such a classy animal and such an incredible competitor that he won in spite of it. As far as the answer to the safety question, it's important for safety because if you've got a horse that's really trying to get out badly, or even to the point where it's going to bolt, the stick can get the horse's attention and help you guide the horse around a turn. If you're going 3/4 of a mile on a mile's oval and you're down on the inside and your horse ducks in and tries to make the gap, it's a very useful tool to have the stick in your left hand to get the horse's attention, get him to run across. The stick, I'm sure, has saved a lot of, or prevented a lot of accidents and incidents when it's used properly. But that's my answer as far as the safety goes.
So we're going to show you a race in just a second from a jurisdiction where they don't allow whips. And the question I'm going to ask you to think about when you watch this is, if you were allowed to hold it and not use it, as Ramon says, on that day he won. I'm sure on some other day he lost, you know, by a horse who was hit more and came up and passed him. To Monty Roberts' point, there are going to be winners and losers. So I'd like you to watch this race and tell me what you think of it. This is a race from Norway. I hope.
They're not responding very well. I guess one thing you can say about this is everybody's on a level playing field.
So in Norway, as you'll notice, none of the riders have whips. They were banned in 1982. Riders can carry them in 2-year-old races, but they cannot carry them in races when they're riding 3-year-olds and up. So there's a full field of horses. Somebody won, somebody lost, somebody was in the middle. Chris, would you have an objection to trying some experimental races like this, where, to your point, if you felt more comfortable carrying a whip, you could, but where again, it's certainly, to my view anyway, a nice-looking product.
Well, I'm certainly in favor of trial and error. You know, I don't think, I think it'd be worth a try, but just to see if we got any feedback from the public. But this is going to sound, I'll just say it. The number of true horsemen in our business has declined a great deal over the last 30 years. And quite frankly, there's only going to be a certain percentage of the trainers that have the skill and the ability to get the horses to train in such a way that they'll give you everything they have in the afternoon. And on those horses, you do need a stick to encourage them to go.
Ramon, do you think you'd still be in the Hall of Fame if there had been whipless racing, if you had just had to rely on your hands, your communication, other means of encouraging the horse? Would you still be where you are today?
I hope so. I believe that you adapt one way or another. Someone's success is not really just based on how they use the riding crop. Things will change slightly and people will adapt. And I think that the outcome at the end of the day will be pretty much the same. I did prior to becoming a jockey, which is something that always comes to mind, and it has to do with this. I did show jumping one year, and my teacher said something that's back in Venezuela 24 years ago, and he said something to me at one time that I will never forget, and he said, the best jockey is that the one that the horses notices the least. I'm all for really not getting in the way of the horses, but this needs to be a learning curve that it requires some effort from different aspects. Going back to the whip, I absolutely, if I'm on a horseback, whether I'm using it or not, I feel much safer having one.
I'm not sure if you remember, Chris, back in the 70s, Hialeah used to run the first 2-year-old races of the year, and those races were run without whips.
Yeah, they do it. They did it at Santa Anita for a long time too. The baby races go to a quarter mile out of the chute. You couldn't use a stick on them.
Yeah, I rode those races, and there was never a problem.
And it's funny because it's the opposite in Norway. In Norway, the only sticks are in 2-year-old races.
So as I said before, I'm not an ex-jockey, I'm not a scientist, but I'm a business person. And as a business person engaged in a business that involves animals, I wondered what effect on our business the perception of the whip has and the perception of abuse has. So I took a little poll, both on Twitter and Facebook, and asked how people felt about the use of the whip. 30% of people who identified themselves as current fans say it's not okay to whip racehorses. 25% of them said whipping turns them off to horse racing, and 30% said jockeys should carry whips for safety only. And so I'd like to ask each of you, in a changing America where SeaWorld has now done away with killer whales because they've decided it's a bad business decision, and whereas Gunnar mentioned the largest circus in America no longer uses elephants because they found it to be a bad business decision, is this maybe a good business decision for us to make some serious changes? Chris?
We're here. We're talking about it. We're trying to move things forward, trying to make it a better environment for the horses. And I think we need to continue to do more work like this, and to have the lines of communication remain open. And one of my biggest pet peeves about the use of the crop is when a horse is way back in the field in the last eighth of a mile and the jock is just wailing on him. Not going to get a piece of the purse, not going to benefit the betting public, yet they just continue to hammer on the horses. If I was a steward, I would definitely call riders in and say, look, we're trying to do what's better for the horse, do what's best for the horse. That's not what's best for the horse. And so I would do my best to see if I could get some rule changes. I was totally disappointed and quite shocked that California reverted back to an older rule where you can hit a horse 4 times in succession instead of 3. But if I was in the stand, I would call riders in and say, look, this is not the way you ride a horse professionally.
Ramon, is there a number of strikes you think is acceptable to the public, or do you think it's an all or nothing sort of situation? Either you carry the whip and don't use it, or...
That's one of those things that if you open it to judgment, everybody's going to give you a different opinion. And I cannot emphasize enough on the need to really go back to the beginning or back to basics and really identify the impact that the riding crop has on a horse. Because if we, even for example purposes or analogy, we put it in the lights of SeaWorld or the elephants from the circus, that is really not accurate. That is pretty brutal. So it's a matter of really going to identifying, because even in the beginning when you mentioned about Monty Roberts, one of the words that he used is that the horses are running because of the pain. And I do not want to feel as if the horses currently are running because of the pain. It is the encouragement. Same thing, turning for home, the horses respond tremendously well to what we call chirping, or we go like, and that, is that painful to them? It's not, it's an encouragement. So it's really, it is important to, in order to be in the place where the industry needs to be, because the fans are priority here. We all depend on our fan base. However, if we continue to put Band-Aids on top of the beliefs or the perception, we're not going anywhere. So back to your question, I don't really know the answer. I definitely think that the jockeys should have a riding crop, even from safety reason. As far as how many times, I don't really know.
Gunnar, you have a...
Again, as a steward, and I can address Chris's situation, anytime a rider is well out of it, we're going to bring them in, we're going to fine them for something like that. Conversely, if a rider is 6 in front and he's still pounding on one, we're going to bring him in, and we're going to fine him for that. We don't put up with it anymore in Ontario, and quite honestly, the numbers have dropped. Even the riders coming out of town now from Europe and from the United States, because we've got several big, European style races on our turf. And we find those gentlemen because of 200 or 400 or, those progressive fines just don't fit $1.5 million race. We fine them 20% of their salary. And we've hit a couple of riders for $5,000 and $6,000. And now they come back, and the first thing we'll do is we'll talk with them in the room and say, do you remember our whipping rules? Oh, yes, sir. And you know what? That race looks so much better. It just looks so much better. And it's tough for European riders because they have a different style of hitting, too. They reach back above their back. And that's, if a rider does that one time down the lane in a $1.5 million race, it's really hard to fine him 20% of his salary for one strike. But if we've warned him before and he does it 2 or 3 times, we're going to hit them. And you know what? They've all abided to those rules, and they've all adhered. These guys are professionals out there, and once they get the hint, it seems to, hit home.
So we have a question from, I believe, Donna Brothers in the audience, which is, how would the panel feel about not being allowed to turn the whip over or cock the whip? Each of you quickly.
In that Australian study, they had these, Mick Peterson would be very interested in seeing that study. They put these sensors on their mechanical horses, and they tested both styles, cocking the stick and hitting with the stick up and backhanded. And those sensors determined there was equal amount of pressure from both strikes. So, and I've ridden with a lot of guys, well, Lafitte, Eddie, when they reach back and hit a horse and their stick is not cocked, it makes a loud noise, just as loud as if your stick is cocked. It's so important to hit a horse in the proper part of the stride. That's the most important thing.
I think we have some more questions from Kathy.
We actually have a couple regulatory things in nature. So the first was just a clarification on the current CHRB situation there with their rule, is that it is currently still at the 3-strike, but it is out for public comment period for increasing to a 4th strike within the last 16th. So if anyone wanted to address that, they could. And then also there were some questions related to that CHRB regulation regarding should it remain at 3? Should it be less, maybe 2, et cetera, like that? And then the other side of the regulatory question was, just in general, was do you feel that, or should there be more formal training or stricter licensing with jockeys in respect to crop use?
I absolutely agree with that, yeah. I'm sorry, Rick, I stand corrected. Yeah, I think education, not for just the young riders, but the veteran riders who have been using a particular style where it hits the horse in the flank all the time. I think it's very important to let them know what we know and what we've shared here today. I think it'd be beneficial going forward.
I agree. And again, we don't have a program like Chris runs down here with apprentices and teaches young people how to become riders for the future. And it's changed a lot since our day. I know we don't have trainers that want to take a rider under their wing and teach them, and we don't have riders in the room that really don't want to sit down with a young guy and take him under his wing and give him some pointers. So we need some way to educate them early on. We do have a good apprentice program in Canada where they have to go through a certain criteria before they're eligible to ride races, and then they're also told at any time if we feel they're not capable, we can take their license away. So, but the use of the crop should be part of that education.
So, I'm going to say from a personal standpoint, you guys have all told a lot of personal stories. My children were both raised in a home where both parents work in the racing industry. We have a box at Monmouth Park, take them racing all over the world, and they will not walk into the living room when I'm watching the Kentucky Derby. I think American Pharoah's Kentucky Derby was sort of the final straw for them, and if you ask my daughter why, she says it's because I can't stand to see animals be hit. So before I came here, I asked some questions of people in the office to see if they had anything to ask you. This question is from Barry Weisbord. It'll probably be the last question. We have 3 minutes. And Barry asks, name one way in which hitting racehorses is a positive thing for our industry. It's a tough question.
Well, if you've got a very, very well-bred colt who's gone through his conditions readily, but he's like an Ali Sheba, that he's the type of horse that he won't go forward, and now you're running in a stake, and you are darn sure the best thing that can happen to you is get black type, then if the stick is necessary, it's necessary. I know if Barry's getting ready to, if Barry just bought a horse and he's going to pinhook it, and he knows the horse needs an aggressive ride, well, he's gonna expect to get the aggressive ride to cause that colt to appreciate in value.
That would more be a good thing for Barry and not the industry so much, but I understand your point. Ramon?
Yes, again, as a jockey, you are there to protect the interests of the fan and the owner has a big interest on their horse. So because of the reason I gave before that each and every horse is different, the overall idea, or the overall thought that I have is that, of course, the riding crop is definitely overrated and probably in many cases creates more problem, not because of the severity of the impact, just the horses are giving you all they have, and it's like trying to tell you, I'm trying my best, and can have an adverse effect. However, there are cases, the Ali Shebas out there that will absolutely respond to the horse. So because every horse is different, it is absolutely necessary in some cases for you to be able to provide with the best effort for that horse.
Gunnar, you have a final comment?
It's hard to add anything to my colleagues here, but the only time that I would see it is to shake them up and try and get that little bit of extra. Again, it's my point is that you just don't abuse it and overdo it. It's there to wake them up, shake them up, and if they don't respond, you put it away.
Donna, do we have time for one more, or are we? Okay. Thank you all. I feel like we could talk about this subject for
Thank you.
for days and not 45 minutes.
Thanks.
Thank you all for participating.